The thunderclap shattered the silent prairie night, illuminating Willow Nash's weathered cabin in a brilliant flash of white that left the scent of burning pine hanging in the air. She stood frozen at her window, counting the seconds until the next strike, her honey-blonde hair falling loose around her shoulders as a second bolt cleaved through the darkness and struck the tall oak beside her home. The year was 1875, and life in Council Bluffs, Iowa had been unforgiving since her husband's passing 3 winters prior. Willow pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching the storm's fury build over the western horizon. At 26, she had grown accustomed to solitude, to the endless work of maintaining the small homestead at the edge of town. The 4 acres of land, a milk cow, and 2 horses were all that remained of the life she and Thomas had built before typhoid fever took him away. "Just me and you now," she whispered to the storm, an old habit born of too many quiet nights. The horses whinnied nervously in the small stable as another flash lit the sky. Willow grabbed her shawl, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. She needed to check on them, storm or not. Animals had a way of hurting themselves when frightened, and those horses were her lifeline to town. The moment she stepped onto her porch, the wind nearly knocked her back through the doorway. Rain pelted sideways, stinging her skin as she squinted into the downpour. Clutching the railing, she had taken only 3 steps when a blinding light surrounded her, and a deafening crack split the air. The lightning struck with such force that Willow felt the ground shudder beneath her feet. She stumbled backward as flames erupted from the corner of her cabin roof, golden and hungry against the black sky. "No!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the wind's howl. She ran to the rain barrel, frantically searching for the bucket she kept nearby, knowing even as she did that one person with a single pail stood no chance against nature's fury. Smoke billowed from beneath the eaves, and sparks danced along the roofline. The sound of hoofbeats barely registered until they were upon her, a horse and rider materializing out of the storm like a phantom. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, a tall figure silhouetted against the burning cabin. "Get your valuables," he shouted over the storm's rage. "This roof won't hold." Willow hesitated only a moment before darting inside. The air was already thick with smoke, and she coughed as she snatched the small wooden box containing her wedding ring and Thomas's pocket watch from beside her bed. She grabbed the quilt her mother had made, a photograph of her parents, and the leather pouch of coins hidden beneath a loose floorboard. When she emerged, the stranger was already on her roof, ripping away burning shingles with his bare hands while rain and sweat soaked through his shirt. Another bolt of lightning cracked nearby, illuminating his face, strong-jawed and determined, dark hair plastered to his forehead. "The lightning struck her cabin," he called down to someone Willow couldn't see. A second rider appeared, leading 3 more horses. "Samuel, get down from there. The next strike could kill you." "Then I'll stand where it falls," the man called Samuel answered, his voice carrying a stubborn resolve that matched the set of his shoulders. For the next hour, Willow found herself part of a desperate battle against the flames. The second rider, introduced breathlessly as Jeb, Samuel's trail partner, organized a bucket line from the well. Samuel Van Horne, as he later introduced himself, worked tirelessly alongside Willow, his strength and calm direction turning what should have been a total loss into a salvageable disaster. By the time they had extinguished the last embers, the storm had moved eastward, leaving behind the clean scent of rain-washed earth. The cabin stood, though a quarter of the roof was gone, and water damage had ruined most of Willow's sparse furnishings. "Thank you," she said, sitting heavily on an overturned barrel, exhaustion making her limbs feel leaden. "If you hadn't come along." Samuel Van Horne pushed his soaked hat back, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds. "We were making camp about a mile west when we saw the lightning hit. No decent man would ride past." "Decent men are scarce out here?" Willow replied, immediately regretting her bitter tone. I'm Willow Nash. This land is mine. Samuel nodded, his gaze taking in the damaged cabin, the small vegetable garden, and the modestly fenced pasture beyond. Samuel Van Horne, my friend and I are cattle buyers heading to Omaha. Jeb approached, leading their horses. We need to find shelter for the night, Sam. Storm might circle back. Samuel looked at Willow's ruined roof, then back at her face. Mrs. Nash, do you have family in town who can take you in until repairs can be made? Miss, she corrected quietly. And no, the nearest neighbors are the Hendersons, 3 miles east. A silent communication passed between the two men. Jeb nodded and mounted his horse. I'll ride to the Hendersons and let them know what's happened, Jeb said. Maybe they can come help in the morning. There's no need, Willow began, but Samuel cut her off with a gentle firmness. You can't stay here tonight. The structure isn't safe, and what's left will be soaked through. He gestured toward the stable. Is that dry? Willow nodded reluctantly. Then we'll make camp there. Jeb will inform your neighbors, and I'll help you salvage what can be saved from inside. Something in his tone brooked no argument, and Willow found herself too tired to protest. Together they moved what furniture they could into the undamaged part of the cabin, covering it with oilcloth. Samuel worked methodically, his movements economical, his direction clear. In the stable, he insisted she take the small tack room while he slept with the horses. As Willow settled onto a makeshift bed of horse blankets, she realized it had been years since anyone had taken charge for her, had shouldered her burdens even for a moment. The sensation was both unsettling and oddly comforting. Why did you say that? She asked through the thin wall that separated them. About standing where the lightning falls? There was a long pause before Samuel answered, his voice carrying a hint of something Willow couldn't quite name. My pa used to say a man who won't stand his ground during a storm has no business claiming to have backbone during fair weather. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. The simple past tense hung in the air between them. Was mine, Willow offered in return. And my husband, too. Samuel said nothing for a moment. I'm sorry for your losses, Miss Nash. Thank you for your help tonight, Mr. Van Horne. Samuel, he corrected. Or Sam, if you prefer. Willow, she responded, surprising herself with the informality. Sleep claimed her soon after, the exhaustion of fear and firefighting pulling her into a dreamless rest. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the stable window, and the scent of coffee filled the air. Outside, Samuel had built a small fire and was cooking something in a cast-iron skillet. His dark hair was still damp, his face freshly shaved. He looked up as she approached, offering a small smile that transformed his serious face. Hope you don't mind, he said, gesturing to the skillet. Found some flour and dried apples in your pantry that survived. Made Johnny cakes. Willow accepted the tin mug of coffee he offered. You cook. A man who can't cook starves on the trail, he replied with a shrug. It's nothing fancy, but the Johnny cakes were delicious, crisp on the outside and tender within, the dried apples providing unexpected sweetness. Willow couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for her. They ate in companionable silence, watching as the morning sun illuminated the damage to her cabin. Half the roof was gone, revealing the sky above her bedroom and kitchen. The eastern wall was scorched black, and water pooled on her floors. It can be fixed, Samuel said, following her gaze. Roof first, then the water damage. I can't afford to hire help right now, Willow admitted. Not until I sell my crops come fall. Samuel studied her for a long moment. Our business in Omaha won't take more than a few days. If you'd permit it, Miss Nash, Jeb and I could return and help with repairs. Willow looked at him sharply. Why would you do that? You don't know me. His weathered face softened. I know what it's like to rebuild alone. It's not something I'd wish on anyone. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching wagons drew their attention. Jeb returned with not only the Hendersons but 3 other families from nearby homesteads. The men brought tools and lumber. The women carried baskets of food and bundles of spare linens. Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman with kind eyes, enveloped Willow in a warm embrace. You'll stay with us until the roof's mended, she declared. No arguments. For the next 2 days, Council Bluffs showed Willow what community truly meant. Men worked from dawn until dusk replacing her roof and repairing damaged walls. Women scrubbed away smoke damage and hung drying linens in the summer sun. Children carried water and nails, eager to help. And through it all, Samuel Van Horne worked alongside them, his knowledge of carpentry proving invaluable. He directed the roof repair, fashioned new support beams, and taught Willow how to mix a whitewash that would cover the smoke stains. On the evening of the 2nd day, as the workers departed and Willow's cabin stood sound once more, Samuel approached her with his hat in his hands. Jeb and I ride out at first light, he said. Our business can't wait any longer. Willow nodded, ignoring the unexpected pang of disappointment. I can't thank you enough, Samuel. You've been. She hesitated, searching for the right words. More kind than a stranger has any obligation to be. He smiled then, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Not strangers anymore, I'd say. That night, she insisted he and Jeb take supper with her in the newly repaired cabin. They ate venison stew provided by the Hendersons, and Jeb entertained them with stories of their cattle buying adventures across the territory. As the evening drew to a close, Samuel walked outside with Willow. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. The cabin looks good, he said, gazing up at the new roof. Should hold through winter and beyond. Thanks to you and the others. Willow wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. When do you think you'll return this way? Samuel looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. After Omaha, we head to Kansas City. Could be 6 weeks, maybe more. Willow nodded, keeping her face carefully neutral. Safe travels, then. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden horse. Made this last night. Thought you might like it. The carving was simple but beautiful, the horse captured in mid-gallop. Willow ran her fingers over the smooth surface. It's lovely. Thank you. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and for a moment, neither moved away. Then Samuel cleared his throat and stepped back. Good night, Willow Nash, he said softly. Good night, Samuel Van Horne, she replied, clutching the wooden horse as she watched him walk away. True to his word, Samuel and Jeb departed at dawn. Willow stood in her doorway, watching until they disappeared over the western horizon, telling herself the hollow feeling in her chest was merely gratitude, nothing more. The weeks that followed saw Willow throwing herself into work with renewed vigor. The garden needed tending, fence posts required mending, and there was always sewing to be done for extra money. Mrs. Henderson invited her to Sunday suppers, and slowly, Willow found herself becoming part of the community in ways she hadn't been since Thomas died. Summer faded into autumn, the prairie grasses turning golden beneath the harvest sun. Willow sold her modest crop of corn and potatoes in town, carefully counting the coins that would see her through winter. She found herself scanning the faces of travelers passing through Council Bluffs, though she wouldn't admit even to herself who she was looking for. October brought the first frost, painting the world silver in the early mornings. Willow was chopping wood for her stove when she heard the approach of horses. Looking up, she shielded her eyes against the low autumn sun and felt her heart quicken at the familiar silhouette. Samuel Van Horne rode alone, his horse laden with packs. He dismounted at her gate, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Nash," he greeted her, his voice carrying the same quiet strength she remembered. "Mr. Van Horne." She lowered the axe, acutely aware of her work-worn dress and hair escaping its pins. "I didn't expect to see you again. I said I'd return," he reminded her with a slight smile. His face was more tan than before, his frame leaner after weeks on the trail. "If I'm intruding—" "No," she said too quickly, then composed herself. "No, you're welcome here. Where is Jeb?" "Headed home to Missouri. His sister's expecting a child." Samuel glanced at the woodpile. "You've been busy." Willow nodded, gesturing toward her cabin. "Would you like some coffee? It's turning cold." Inside, Samuel settled at her small table while Willow stoked the fire and set the coffee to boil. She was intensely conscious of his presence filling her small home, the scent of leather and horses and open air that clung to him. "Your roof held," he observed, looking up at the ceiling. "It did." Willow placed a mug before him. "How was your journey? Did you find the cattle you were seeking?" As Samuel spoke of Kansas City and the cattle markets, Willow found herself studying him the way his hands cradled the mug, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the gentle rumble of his voice. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 35, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years in the sun. "And what about you?" he asked finally. "How have you fared since the storm?" Willow told him of her harvest, of Mrs. Henderson's kindness, of the new schoolteacher who had arrived in Council Bluffs. As she spoke, she realized how much had changed since that lightning-filled night. "I've been thinking," Samuel said when she finished, his tone careful, "about what you said regarding repairs. Before winter sets in properly, your cabin could use some additional work. The western wall needs reinforcement, and that chimney should be repointed before the heavy snows." Willow's pride bristled. "I can't pay you, Mr. Van Horne. I'm not asking for payment." He met her gaze steadily. "I'm asking for permission to help." "Why?" The question escaped before she could temper it. Samuel considered his answer, turning his empty mug between his hands. "Because I find myself concerned for your welfare," he said finally. "And because I've been without a destination since Jeb departed. I thought—" He hesitated. "I thought perhaps I could winter in Council Bluffs." The implication hung between them not just the repairs, but his prolonged presence, his desire to remain nearby. Willow found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. "The Hendersons often take in boarders during the winter months," she said at last. "They have a large home." Samuel nodded, something like relief crossing his features. "I'll inquire with them tomorrow." That evening, Willow insisted he stay for supper. They ate rabbit stew and cornbread, and Samuel told her of his life before cattle buying, of growing up on a Pennsylvania farm, of fighting in the war, of drifting westward afterward in search of something he couldn't name. "And your husband?" he asked carefully. "If you don't mind my asking." Willow stirred her stew, remembering Thomas's laughing eyes and gentle hands. "He came west looking for gold in '68. Found me instead. We married after knowing each other 6 weeks. She smiled at the memory. "People said it wouldn't last, but we were happy. Then typhoid came through 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Samuel said simply. "As am I for your losses." Willow had learned during their conversation that Samuel had lost both parents and a younger brother to influenza. As darkness fell, Samuel prepared to make camp by her stable, refusing her offer of the small guest pallet inside. "Wouldn't be proper," he insisted with old-fashioned courtesy that made her smile. The next morning, he rode into town to speak with the Hendersons. By nightfall, it was arranged Samuel would board with them through winter, working for his keep by helping with their livestock and making repairs to their aging barn. What followed was a season unlike any Willow had known since Thomas died. Samuel worked on her cabin every afternoon, reinforcing walls, repointing the chimney, and adding extra insulation against the prairie winds. Together they repaired her chicken coop and built a shelter for firewood. Willow found herself looking forward to his arrival each day, to the comfortable silence they shared as they worked side by side. Samuel wasn't a talkative man, but when he did speak, his words carried weight and often unexpected wisdom. As November deepened toward December, they established a routine. Mornings, Samuel worked for the Hendersons. Afternoons were spent at Willow's homestead. And each evening, they shared supper before he returned to town. The first heavy snow came in mid-December, transforming the prairie into a white wilderness overnight. Willow woke to find drifts piled against her door and wondered if Samuel would make the journey from town. By mid-morning, she spotted him approaching on horseback, a woolen scarf wrapped around his face against the biting cold. "You shouldn't have come in this weather," she scolded as she helped him stable his horse. "Promised I'd finish the shelves today," he said, stomping snow from his boots. "Besides, Mrs. Henderson sent preserves." He produced a cloth-wrapped jar from his saddlebag. They spent the afternoon installing shelves in Willow's pantry, their breath visible in the cool air despite the roaring fire in the stove. As daylight began to fade, Samuel glanced out the window at the thickening snow. "I should head back before it gets worse," he said reluctantly. Willow followed his gaze to the white landscape, concern furrowing her brow. "It's nearly 4 miles to town, and the snow's getting deeper. Perhaps you should stay." The moment the words left her mouth, Willow felt a blush rising to her cheeks. Samuel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That wouldn't be proper, Miss Nash." "Neither would finding you frozen in a snowdrift tomorrow," she countered. "You can take the guest pallet. I'll hang a blanket for privacy." After a moment's hesitation, Samuel nodded. "If the snow lets up by morning, I'll leave at first light." That evening stretched long before them. Willow cooked a stew with salted pork and dried vegetables, and Samuel taught her a card game his grandfather had played. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable. "You're good at this," Samuel commented as Willow won another hand. "At cards." She smiled, gathering the deck. "My father taught me. He said a woman should know how to spot a cheat." "Wise man." Samuel leaned back in his chair. "Though I'd wager he didn't expect you to use that knowledge to clean out an unsuspecting cattle buyer." Willow laughed, a sound she realized had become more frequent in Samuel's presence. "Consider it payment for the shelves." Later, as they prepared for sleep with a quilt hung between them, Willow found herself oddly aware of his presence on the other side of the thin barrier. The sound of his breathing, the creak of the pallet as he settled these small intimacies felt both foreign and strangely familiar. "Samuel?" she asked into the darkness. "Yes. Why did you really come back to Council Bluffs?" The silence stretched so long she thought he might not answer. "I've wandered since the war ended," he said finally, his voice low. 12 years of never staying anywhere longer than it took to earn enough money to move on. But when I rode away from here in August, I found myself thinking about your cabin, about how it stood after the lightning struck, about how you stood." Willow lay still, her heart beating rapidly in her chest. "I thought perhaps it was time to stop wandering," he continued, "to see if I could build something that would last through storms." "And have you decided?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Another pause. "I'm still deciding." Morning brought clear skies and a transformed world. Snow blanketed everything in pristine white, sparkling in the winter sunlight. Samuel departed after breakfast, promising to return once he'd completed his obligations to the Hendersons. The days leading to Christmas passed in a swirl of activity. The women of Council Bluffs gathered to make candles and preserves, to exchange patterns and recipes, to prepare for the holiday. Willow found herself invited to these gatherings, included in ways she hadn't been before. "Samuel Van Horne is quite taken with you," Mrs. Henderson remarked as they kneaded bread dough side by side. "Never seen that man so settled." Willow concentrated on her dough. "He's been kind to help with my repairs." Mrs. Henderson's knowing smile said more than words could. On Christmas Eve, the entire community gathered at the small church in town. Lanterns glowed in the windows, and pine boughs decorated the altar. Children performed the nativity story while proud parents watched. Afterward, everyone shared food and fellowship in the adjoining meeting hall. Samuel found Willow by the punch bowl, dressed in his Sunday best, a dark wool coat and freshly polished boots. He looked different, almost uncomfortable in the formal attire. "Merry Christmas, Miss Nash," he said, offering her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "You didn't need to," she began, but he shook his head. "I wanted to." Inside the package was a leather-bound journal, its pages creamy and unmarked. "For your thoughts," Samuel explained. "You mentioned once that you used to write." Willow ran her fingers over the smooth cover. "It's beautiful. Thank you." She reached into her pocket and withdrew her own gift, a knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "It isn't much," she said, suddenly self-conscious. Samuel took it reverently, wrapping it around his neck immediately. "No one has made me anything in a very long time," he said quietly. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had yet named. The moment was interrupted by the announcement of carols. As the community gathered around the piano, Samuel offered Willow his arm. Together they joined the circle, their voices blending with those around them in ancient songs of hope and joy. When it came time to depart, snow was falling again in gentle flakes. Families loaded into wagons and sleighs, calling Christmas wishes to one another. Samuel helped Willow into the Hendersons' wagon, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. "Will you come tomorrow?" she asked. "For Christmas dinner?" "I'd be honored," he replied, his breath visible in the cold air. That night, alone in her cabin with the new journal beside her bed, Willow wrote for the first time in years. She wrote of lightning and fire, of rebuilding and community. And she wrote of Samuel Van Horne, the cattle buyer with storm-gray eyes who had appeared when she needed him most. Christmas Day dawned bright and cold. Willow rose early to prepare, roasting a chicken and baking bread, setting her small table with her best linens. She wore her good dress, dark green wool with lace at the collar, and pinned her hair more carefully than usual. Samuel arrived at midday, bearing a small potted pine tree adorned with paper stars and dried berries. "Mrs. Henderson's idea," he explained as he set it on Willow's table. "She said every home should have something festive for Christmas." The simple meal they shared felt like a feast. They talked of childhood Christmases, of traditions and memories, finding common ground in their shared appreciation for simple pleasures. As they washed dishes together afterward, their hands occasionally brushed, each contact sending a current of awareness through Willow. "I have something to tell you," Samuel said as they settled before the fire with cups of coffee. "I've made a decision about my wandering." Willow's heart skipped. "Oh, the Hendersons' son isn't returning from Denver as they'd hoped. They've offered to sell me their north pasture, 40 acres with the old Miller cabin on it." He studied her face carefully. "I'm considering accepting." "You'd stay in Council Bluffs?" Willow tried to keep her voice neutral. "I would." Samuel set his cup aside. "If I had reason enough to put down roots." The meaning behind his words hung in the air between them. Willow looked down at her hands, then back at his weathered face. "The winters are harsh here," she said softly. "I don't mind the cold." Summers can be brutal. I've weathered worse. Willow's lips curved into a small smile. The Miller cabin needs a new floor and proper windows. I'm handy with a hammer. Samuel leaned forward, his eyes serious. Willow, I'm not a man for flowery words, but I find myself thinking of you more often than not, of your courage and your strength, of the way you've made this piece of land yours through sheer determination. He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. I'm not asking anything of you yet. It's too soon and we're still learning each other. But I'd like the chance to see where this might lead, if you're willing. Willow looked at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers smaller but equally work-worn. I've been alone a long time, Samuel. I've learned to rely on myself. As have I, he acknowledged. Perhaps that's why I recognize the value of what we might build together. Not out of desperation or necessity, but out of choice. Willow studied his face, the earnest eyes, the firm set of his jaw. This was a man who stood his ground during storms, who rebuilt what lightning destroyed. A man not unlike herself. I'd like that chance as well, she said finally, squeezing his hand. To see where this might lead. The smile that broke across Samuel's face transformed him, erasing years of solitary wandering in an instant. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then I'll speak with the Hendersons tomorrow, he said. Winter settled into its rhythm of short days and long nights. Samuel purchased the north pasture and began repairs on the Miller cabin, riding to Willow's homestead whenever weather permitted. Together they planned for spring which fields to plant, whether to increase his small herd of cattle, how best to utilize their combined resources. In the evenings, they would sit before Willow's fire, reading aloud from her small collection of books or simply talking. Sometimes Samuel would whittle while Willow sewed, comfortable silence stretching between them. It was during these quiet moments that Willow felt her heart opening, thawing like the creek after a long freeze. The first kiss came on a February evening when Samuel had stayed to repair a leak in her roof. Snow fell outside, and the lamp cast golden light across the cabin's interior. Willow was pouring coffee when Samuel's hand touched her shoulder. Willow, he said simply. She turned, and he was there, his eyes asking a question she answered by lifting her face to his. The kiss was gentle, reverent. A meeting of souls who had known loneliness and found unexpected companionship. When they drew apart, Samuel cradled her face in his hands. I've wanted to do that since Christmas, he confessed. Willow smiled, covering his hands with her own. I've wanted you to. Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and muddy roads. The Miller cabin, now the Van Horne cabin, neared completion. Samuel had added a proper bedroom, expanded the kitchen, and installed glass windows that caught the morning light. On the first truly warm day of April, Samuel invited Willow to see the finished home. As they approached on horseback, Willow saw that he had planted saplings along the path to the door and built a small covered porch across the front. It's wonderful, Samuel, she said as he showed her the interior, pride evident in every gesture. The cabin was simple but solid, with shelves for books and hooks for cooking pots, a table he had crafted himself and chairs traded for 2 calves. In the kitchen, Samuel seemed suddenly nervous, fidgeting with his hat. There's one more thing I wanted to show you, he said. He led her to the bedroom, where a beautiful quilt covered the bed, one she recognized as Mrs. Henderson's handiwork. Beside the bed stood a small table with a drawer, and on it sat the wooden horse Samuel had carved for her months ago. I thought it might look at home here, he said quietly. Willow turned to him, understanding dawning. Samuel? He took her hands in his expression solemn. Willow Nash, I've loved you since the night I watched you carry your mother's quilt from a burning cabin, determination set in every line of your face. His voice grew husky, You make me want to build rather than wander, to plant rather than harvest and move on." Dropping to one knee, he withdrew a simple gold band from his pocket. "I'm asking you to marry me, to join our lands and our lives, to face whatever storms come our way, together." Tears blurred Willow's vision as she gazed down at this man who had come into her life on the wings of a storm. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Samuel Van Horne." They were married in May in the Council Bluffs church, surrounded by the community that had become family to them both. Willow wore a new dress of pale blue, a crown of spring flowers in her hair. Samuel stood tall in a new suit, the blue scarf she had knitted him at Christmas folded carefully in his pocket. The celebration afterward filled the meeting hall with laughter and music. As evening approached, Samuel led his bride to their waiting wagon, decorated with ribbons and flowers by the town's children. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Van Horne?" he asked, his eyes filled with love as he helped her onto the seat. Willow looked back at her old cabin, now closed up but not abandoned. They had decided to keep both homesteads, using hers for storage and guest quarters, combining their lands into a promising start for what they hoped would grow into a proper ranch. "I am," she said, linking her fingers with his. As they drove toward their new life, the setting sun cast long shadows across the prairie, turning the new grass to gold. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, not threatening, but promising life-giving rain for their newly planted fields. "Looks like we might get a storm tonight," Samuel remarked, squeezing her hand. Willow leaned against his shoulder, unafraid. "Then we'll weather it together." The years that followed brought both joys and challenges to the Van Hornes. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, arrived the following spring, followed 2 years later by a son they called Thomas, in honor of Willow's first husband. Their combined homesteads prospered under their joint care. Samuel's knowledge of cattle breeding proved valuable, and Willow's skill with gardens and preserving meant their cellar was always well stocked. They added rooms to the cabin as their family grew, eventually building a proper house with a wide porch where they could watch summer storms roll across the prairie. Council Bluffs grew too, the railroad bringing new settlers and opportunities. Samuel served on the town council, his steady judgment respected by newcomers and old-timers alike. Willow taught reading at the expanded school during winters, passing on her love of books to a new generation. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel presented Willow with a specially commissioned painting of their original cabins, the lightning-struck oak tree still standing sentinel beside hers. "To remind us where we began," he said as they stood on their porch, watching their children play in the yard with the family dog. Willow leaned into his embrace, thinking of that stormy night when lightning had struck her cabin and a stranger had promised to stand where it fell. "I sometimes think that lightning was the best thing that ever happened to me," she mused. Samuel chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I thank God for it every day." As evening settled over their land, bringing with it the chorus of cicadas and the first twinkling stars, Willow gazed out at the life they had built together, the fields of ripening wheat, the cattle grazing in the distance, the sturdy house filled with books and laughter and love. When lightning flashed on the horizon, neither of them flinched. They had learned that some storms brought destruction, but others cleared the way for new beginnings. And they had learned, most importantly, that whatever came their way, they would face it as they had faced everything since that fateful night together, standing firm, building something that would last through any storm.